I think a big step towards understanding how the world works today comes with realising the goodies and baddies just ain't what they used to be. From the Godfather movie and Michael Corleone, we learned that the pursuit of power is not personal, that it's strictly business. And from another movie, The Usual Suspects, we learned that to seize power, you just need the will to do what the other guy wouldn't. So stress-tested and time-hardened are these truths, us little people are invited to hear them declared on the screen. The truth is so embedded in our everyday reality, courtesy of Hollywood and the rest of the media, they don't care whether we know it or not. After all, what are we going to do about it? All the time I hear people starting sentences with the words, they can't or they won't. In that context, they means the people with power, those manoeuvring to increase and consolidate that power. I always reply, they can, and because they can, sooner or later they will. I mentioned The Godfather, the epic about organised crime. It's my belief that sometime in the last century, government and business got into bed with organised crime, which is to say, with those with the will to do what the other guy wouldn't. I think that alliance has made all the difference. It's why I don't believe the running of the world is any longer about the same old goodies and baddies. For those with power, it's strictly business. For those who want to hold on to that power, by now it's also about self-preservation. Last week, the news was dominated by civil war in Sudan. I'd been waiting for the next distraction after COVID and climate crisis and war in Ukraine, and there it was. Just as with Ukraine, when the news broke about Sudan, I had to look at a map to remind myself exactly where it was. It sits on the Red Sea, on Egypt's southern border. As usual, it turns out geography matters. Sudan recently concluded a deal to let Russia base warships, including nuclear warships, in a port on the Red Sea. Warm water ports have been part of the Russian dream for hundreds of years. The United States don't like the idea of Russia in Sudan, not one little bit. This week, online news channel Redacted reported on recent events there. In August last year, while the deal was brewing, the US appointed an ambassador to Sudan for the first time in a quarter of a century. The following month, that ambassador warned Sudan not to finalise any deal with Russia. In November, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged Sudan to consider, quote, US support for the rapid formation of a civilian-led transitional government, close quote. In December, the US brokered what they like to call a framework agreement between Sudan's military leaders and pro-democracy parties. In February, Sudan went ahead with the deal with Russia. A few days later, the Biden administration sent $200 million in humanitarian aid to Sudan. And in March, Victoria Nuland visited Sudan to discuss democracy. By this month, conflict had escalated between Sudanese armed forces and a breakaway paramilitary group. Last week, the US began evacuating its people. Victoria Nuland is US Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs, the same Victoria Nuland who in February 2014, while frustrated by EU hesitancy about opposing Putin, said, F the EU, except she used the whole word. While on the phone to US Ambassador to Ukraine Geoffrey Pyatt, a call that was recorded and leaked, Nuland later apologised. Nuland's faux pas came during the febrile time that followed Ukraine's then-President Viktor Yanukovych's ill-fated attempts to keep on side with both Washington and Moscow, to ride two horses with just one bottom. He was tempted by NATO and EU membership, but in the end, Putin, in the manner of the aforementioned Godfather, evidently made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And so all the way back in 2014, the fuse was lit for war. Ukraine is devastated. Hundreds of thousands are dead. Infrastructure shattered. Many billions of dollars, pounds and euros have already been blown there. The majority of the weapons sent there can't be traced. Now US companies are gearing up to extract Ukrainian oil. Transnational corporation BlackRock will invest in the Great Rebuild. What goes around comes around, eh? Where there's muck and death, there's brass. And down in Sudan, there's more to know about what appears to be going on there as well. Sudanese journalist David John Bwakali has described the two factions of the Sudanese army at war with one another, one led by Lieutenant General Muhammad Hamdan, head of a paramilitary group called Rapid Support Forces, the other by the Sudanese Army Chief, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. According to Bwakali, the conflict is, quote, not happening in a vacuum. He calls it nothing less than a proxy war between Russia and America, and calls on the Sudanese and indeed all the peoples of Africa to speak up and demand that, quote, America and Russia get their hands off Africa. The days of the shenanigans of the Cold War are completely over, he said, and they cannot fight proxy wars in Africa at the expense of innocent African lives. The puppet masters must stop their evil, diabolical games. For those still thinking war is about protecting people and advancing democracy, I say maybe it was once, but that now it's strictly business at our expense. It's not just the US and Russia dabbling in Sudan, it's Saudi Arabia too. Saudi Arabia is tight with China, apparently, and yet in Sudan they're on side with the US in seeking to broker a peace deal between the warring parties. Strictly business, I suspect. Leave the gun, take the cannoli. Remember the bioweapons labs in Ukraine, the ones that weren't there, and then were, scores of them, right up against the Russian border and backed with US dollars, amid talk of gain of function. Turns out there are bioweapons labs in Sudan as well, supported by the World Health Organization, Brazil, China, the United Arab Emirates, Save the Children, the World Bank, the United Nations. One lab has focused everyone's attention. It's in Khartoum, and in its stores are vials of cholera, measles, polio, and other infectious diseases. It seems to be under the control of people the US does not care for. What is it with bioweapons labs and insecure countries? Why are international interests so often involved in bioweapons research conducted in countries that turn into war zones? Back in 1998, the Clinton administration bombed the bejesus out of a factory in Sudan that made half of all the medicines upon which the people of Sudan depended. It was called Al-Shifa in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. Clinton's bombs were claimed to be reprisals for Osama bin Laden's earlier attacks on targets in Kenya and Tanzania. The factory was flattened, killing 1 and injuring 11. Clinton's people said Al-Shifa was making VX nerve agent and that the owners had links to Al-Qaeda, except they almost certainly didn't. Officials later conceded there was no proof of production or storing of nerve gas or of links to Osama bin Laden. In any event, in 2006, the US stepped into Sudan with private pharma companies to fill the void left by the unlawful bombing of Al-Shifa. It's not personal, you might have said. It's strictly business. Back in the early 2010s, it was estimated Sudan was sitting on as much as 7 billion barrels of oil. There are largely unexploited reserves too of gold, uranium and iron ore, along with much more mineral wealth besides. So much money to be made. The scale and influence of the military-industrial complex is almost too great to be contemplated. Millions of dollars are spent lobbying politicians of all stripes. Lucrative arms contracts are awarded. Endless wars are embarked upon. The defence spending of the US is bigger than that of the 15 next biggest national defence budgets in the world combined. Every year, some few US politicians and others ask to see accounts for where and how those many hundreds of billions of US taxpayers' dollars are spent. And every year the Pentagon somehow fails to provide the requested answers and data. They have failed the last 5 audits. Many of those billions remain unaccounted for. It's all a rotating wheel of spend and profit. The missiles and bullets fly in faraway countries, people die, and the profits fly back just as fast into the coffers of contractors like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman. Much of the survival of the idea in the minds of many that the running of the world is about the same old goodies and baddies is down to the mainstream media that perpetuates the myth. But that mainstream media is dependent, in turn, for its survival on the billions of dollars funneled their way by governments and those same vested interests of the military-industrial complex. If the mainstream media don't tell the right stories, push the approved narrative at the plebs, then the money flow stops. Another movie I think about a lot is Cool Hand Luke, the embodiment of the unbreakable man, played by Paul Newman. No matter what the man tries to do with chains and beatings and the solitary confinement of the box, Luke won't give in. Could it be that simple then? Don't give in. Could it be that all we have to do is emulate the spirit of Cool Hand Luke, that determined stubbornness in defiance of all coercion? US writer and filmmaker James Webb, also one of the most decorated Marines of the Vietnam War, has written about the culture of the Scots-Irish, those migrants who did so much to shape the culture of the United States. He has described the Rednecks, and that name is a badge not of shame but of glowing pride, as the sons and daughters of the Scots-Irish who from century to century and millennium to millennium defied, one after the other, the Romans, the Normans, the English aristocracy in Scotland and then in Ireland, then all of those elitists' descendants in the fledgling USA, as well as every other uncomprehending fool that ever got up in the faces of iron-hard people forged in one furnace after another, they never have and surely never will submit to any top-down authority that seeks to have them set aside their beliefs, their independence, their way of life, and meekly to do what they're told. In a card game in the movie, the eponymous Luke has useless cards but plays them with all that's needed, which is to say with guts and guile. When he wins and his opponent voices his astonishment about being beaten by a hand full of nothing, Luke says, "Sometimes nothing can be a real cool hand." Eric Hoffer was an American philosopher and writer. He wrote, "Again and again I come across the assertion that a society cannot grow and thrive without culturally superior stratums which generate the impulse towards excellence and greatness. There is evidence on every hand that the vigour and health of a society are determined by the quality of the common people rather than the cultural elite. Those of us common people opposing the dictatorial nonsense by the elite have a whole lot more than nothing, and it's a real cool hand. We have everything we need because we have right and we have the truth. Are there any goodies in charge in the world anymore? Sometimes it feels like it's not turtles all the way down, it's baddies. For those baddies, it's strictly business. Here's the thing, unlike Michael Corleone of The Godfather, I say it is personal, 100% personal, and I say the fate of the world is about good and bad, is about what's right and wrong, and that it's long past time to pick a side."